All right, I now welcome representatives of Air Services Australia, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau and the United Firefighters Union of Australia via video conference. Okay, I can see two screens. I'm hoping we've got a few people together in that one room. So could I start for the Hansard record, could you please each give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
I might start. Thank you, Chair. Angus Mitchell. I'm the Chief Commissioner and Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Transport Safety Bureau.
Is that your new appointment, Mr. Hornby?
No, I've got Mr. Hornby's legal counsel and I have two of my directors. So Angus Mitchell
is sorry.
My appointment. That's right. 2 months into the role, Chair.
That's what I meant. So congratulations on your appointment is where I was going. I was distracted by the name on your screen. So
I got a promotion there.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. That's terrific. And if just confirm again the names of the others in the room with you.
Do you want to go around?
Yeah, so Stuart Godley, Director of Transport Safety.
Stuart McLeod, Director of Transport Safety. And Patrick Hornby, General Counsel.
Terrific. Thank you all very much. Now, I have another gentleman on screen.
Yes, Senator. It's Michael Sayers from Slater and Gordon Lawyers. I seek to appear today just on behalf of the United Firefighters Union of Australia and just to speak to the submissions previously filed, I think, by Mr. Von Nider of the aviation branch of the union. I note that Mr. Von Nider is no longer in that capacity as branch secretary of the aviation branch. It's now Mr. Wes Garrett, who sends his apologies today, as does Peter Marshall, the national secretary of the union. So I've just been asked to attend to briefly speak to the submissions and mindful that I don't come from a position of expertise in the industry to take any questions back on notice if any arise.
Fair enough. We won't ask you technical questions about the job. Okay. I understand we also have Michael Walker on teleconference from ATSB. Is that right?
No, just those in the room here with me now. Thanks, Chair.
Terrific. Thank you. And I believe that Air Services Australia might be having some connection issues, so we'll let them join us as we proceed. I'm sorry, Air Services, are you on teleconference?
Air Services Australia here. Peter Curran, the Chief Customer and Strategy Officer, and I'm joined by my colleague
Michelle Bennett, Chief Service Delivery Officer.
Thank you both very much. Can I invite you all to make a brief opening statement before the committee asks questions? Can I start with ATSB? Mr. Mitchell, do you have an opening statement to make?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you also, Senator Stirl, for the opportunity to make a very brief statement, as this is my first appearance before the committee in any of its forms. I came to this role through the maritime career, serving in the Royal Australian Navy, both domestically and on international operations, before taking several maritime roles across New South Wales and Queensland, including being the maritime regulator across those two states. And as we stated before, I'm here with two of the directors, Stu Godley, who has a PhD in human factors, and Stu McLeod, who's a former Army Black Hawk and commercial aviation pilot, and Mr. Pat Hornby. I'll just put some context in our role in improving general aviation safety in general aviation. We receive around 7,000 aviation reports each year, of which we have the resources to select about 60 for investigation. Approximately half of these are in the general aviation sector. Amongst our ranks, we have former pilots, and that includes RPT pilots, general aviation, military and recreational. We have aeronautical engineers, licensed aircraft mechanics, and cabin crew that all work on our aviation investigations. It's important to note that we do prioritise our resources towards occurrences that are likely to have safety lessons for the greatest public benefit. And in terms of this particular hearing, I would like to point out that we certainly recognise the critical role of general aviation in servicing remote and rural communities. Many of our investigators come from the general aviation sector, and indeed from the communities, as do I. And they understand the personal impacts from tragedies as well as the impacts on businesses and the ability to provide connections between communities and cities. Our interest is very firmly in influencing safety actions that decrease and prevent tragic incidents. The ATSB and CASA have separate but complementary roles in improving aviation safety. There will be times when our messaging is aligned, but there will also be other times when the ATSB will unapologetically advocate for CASA to address safety issues. But when there are differences and points of view, these are made very public on our website, as indeed responses from all parties that we find have a role in improving aviation safety. That's the end of my opening statement. Thank you very much, and we stand ready to assist today and beyond as best we can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Curran, do you have an opening statement?
Thank you, Chair and committee members. Yes, I do. Appreciate the opportunity to make a short set of introductory remarks. We understand the focus of the inquiry is primarily on the regulation of general aviation. However, the committee may be interested to know what support Air Services has been providing to the aviation industry, including the general aviation sector, in response to COVID-19. The last 2 years have proven difficult for both Australia and the aviation industry as a whole, as you well know. Travel restrictions, border closures have resulted in severe disruptions to both domestic and international air travel, with significant losses in revenue, financial and, of course, human impacts felt across the industry. During the last financial year, international airline traffic declined by almost 70%, and domestic air traffic fell 24% on the previous year. However, during the downturn, we've also seen some highlights that we didn't expect to see pre-COVID. At the height of the lockdowns in 2020, Sydney to Ballina became one of the busiest air routes in the country. In fact, that route has grown by 188% of pre-COVID traffic levels. The top 5 routes in the country as of September this year were Brisbane Cairns, Brisbane Townsville, Brisbane Mackay, Broome Perth, Karratha Perth and Adelaide Perth. None of these routes were in the top 10 pre-COVID. This demonstrates the major effect that COVID-19 has had on traffic patterns around Australia. Air Services has provided financial assistance to support the general aviation sector and help reduce some of the economic burden on this important part of Australia's aviation landscape. We've cross-subsidised services at most regional locations. We've waived fees for operators with less than $500 of charges per annum. We've not charged for aviation rescue firefighting services. We've implemented fee waivers for not-for-profit aeromedical operators, particularly those in regional and remote communities in Australia, saving them around $3 million per year. Hopefully that's provided you with some useful context and some of the key aspects of the environment we've been operating in and some of Air Services' support to the general aviation community over the last 2 years. We're happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. And finally, Michael, as representative for the the United Firefighters, do you wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I'll be able to keep it very brief and I refer also to the submission 53, I think, as filed. The basic point that the union seeks to make is that having a dedicated aviation rescue firefighting service at airports gives passengers and assets the best possible protection, and that under the current regime, that best possible protection is denied at the vast majority of certified airports in the country. I think there's currently only dedicated Commonwealth-funded aviation rescue firefighting service at 27 airports provided by Air Services out of a total of, I think, 193 certified airports. And that flows from the current regulatory regime that requires an aft service to be provided where there's an international passenger service or any other aerodrome where there's more than 350,000 passengers passed through during the previous financial year. So we acknowledge that that provides aft protection to the vast majority of passengers. But and given that this committee also has a particular focus on rural, regional and remote areas, in almost all cases, it completely denies such a service to people in rural and regional and remote areas. And the current regime appears only to be based on passenger numbers and provision for international passenger service without necessarily assessing the risk factors at other airports where that service is not provided. So what the union seeks to propose is that, and we understand that some work's been done and some significant work's been done in terms of staffing levels at airports that currently do have an ARF service based on TRAs being conducted in accordance with the ICAO standards. We say that process or that detailed risk assessment should be conducted across the board, and there should be provision for providing dedicated ARF services at appropriate staffing levels at any airport where the high enough risk factors are identified. So that's really the essence of the submission. We say that in terms of the focus on rural and regional areas, that they're really missing out. People in the regions, apart from one or two limited exceptions that do have the passenger numbers above 350,000, are missing out on a dedicated ARF service. And without any disrespect to local fire services, state volunteer and professional fire services, we say that the response times are greater and therefore the survivability rates are lower in the event of an incident, and that's something that should be examined, looking at actual risk rather than just passenger numbers. And that an appropriate amendment to the regs should be made to accommodate.
Mr. Sayers, did you just say that you were recommending that for airports with passenger numbers of greater than 300,000?
No, we're saying that the current regime provides for dedicated ARF services at airports with passenger numbers greater than 350,000. My understanding is if it drops to 300,000 and below for greater than 12 months, then that requirement to maintain an ARF service can be reviewed, and it's possible that the ARF service can be removed, but that's purely based on passenger numbers. What we're saying is, irrespective of passenger numbers, an assessment, a proper risk assessment should be conducted across the board, and where appropriate levels of risk are identified, that dedicated ARF services should be provided at those airports, irrespective of passenger numbers.
I'm just reflecting on the passenger numbers in the airfields that I'm familiar with, so not the big cities, but the regional capitals and centres. And I'm trying to think of one that would have that sort of capacity of 300,000. So perhaps the United Firefighters would provide a list of the airfields that they're identifying would fall into that category, just so we've got a better understanding, the committee has a better understanding of the footprint that they're talking about.
Yeah, I think the essence of, for example, Hamilton Island has a dedicated service because they do have passenger numbers above the requisite level. What we're saying is that for any and all other airports that don't have that level of passenger traffic, that if high enough risk level is identified, consideration should be given to provision of a dedicated ARF service.
Again, I'm just trying to identify which. Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. So you're identifying the risk across different airfields. All right. ATSB, Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to throw you an interesting and novel inquiry with no notice at all. And so feel free to take this on notice. Yesterday I had a discussion with BHP. They own 5 airfields where they operate a BAR an aviation risk assessment where they only allow accredited aircraft to have completed the bar to land there. So Moranbah is the one that I'm interested in because that's in my part of the world. The accreditation costs, I'm told, about $120,000. So private charters and general aviation would be excluded from that. I want to ask you, BHP has told me that the reason why this is so important is because they have assessed risk, and so they can only have aviation operators who have completed the bar able to land at their airport, Moranbah Airport. Now, given that it's a private airfield that they've paid for and they operate, this is possibly none of my business. But I was surprised that, given Australian aviation regulations are, I would suggest, some of the most onerous and highest in the world that I'm aware of, particularly around pilot medicals, licensing requirements, ATSB requirements for, sorry, not ATSB, ASA requirements for pilot accreditation to access airfields, maintenance requirements on planes. And so I suggested to BHP that you know, this might be an accreditation that was necessary in their operations overseas. But how do you see Australia's, and setting aside that this is a particular company in a particular airfield, but what are your views on Australia's safety standards for pilots, maintenance, aircraft, and the regulations in this country?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. It is one, I guess we do have a very defined role here, and I've got to be conscious that that isn't as an oversight to the regulator, which is CASA, nor do we question their approach and their regulations that may come in, etc. We do benchmark ourselves in any of our investigations. We look for incidents potentially that are similar to the ones that we are investigating here to see if there are any linkages or lessons to be learned. So we do constantly look overseas, and we have very strong relationships with our counterparts throughout the globe. When it comes to setting the safety standards, we certainly do present, and we have a close association with, whether it be some of the big players in the market, Qantas, Jetstar, Virgin, etc., right down to general aviation and some of the smaller operators. We do provide advice to them or around our findings and explain what we have found and why we've found that. It's very important to note that our investigations are very much evidence and facts-based. And the analysis of that has to be supported by the evidence we've collected. We do, however, do safety studies from time to time, and particularly if there are emerging risks that we believe, and we've done some work, and indeed I've presented in the last couple of weeks to a Qantas Safety Forum around some of the risks that we're seeing coming out of COVID. But to address your specific point on BHP and whether those standards are necessary, that really probably is a question for CASA. We can certainly look at evidence around those types of operations internationally and do some work there, but we'd be very hesitant to provide advice on CASA's approach to that, or indeed a private operator like BHP as well.
Well handled. Thank you. All right. Let's turn back to only one of these three screens would be on at the right time when I wanted to talk to you about my questions. Senator Sterle, do you have any questions just while I'm waiting for my computer to restart?
Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks, Chair. Just I might take the opportunity to just, it's probably out of Mr. Sayer's area of operations, but last time we were talking with the firefighters, there were some serious concerns around Brisbane Airport on the staffing issues, or maybe actually, and it should also go to air services. Has that been resolved? The first Mr. Sayer is unfairly, I mean to say, are you aware of the situation?
Yeah, look, only at a superficial level, in that my reference earlier to the TRAs, we understand that there's been, and it's been going on for more than a year. I have been informed today that process is either concluded or is approaching conclusion, but there was a detailed assessment conducted with a view to identifying appropriate staffing levels and, as I understand it, to resolve that issue that you're touching on at Brisbane and, as I believe, at other airports as well. But the point I make earlier is that, yes, that process, that TRA process has been undertaken, but my understanding is that was with a focus to identifying appropriate staffing levels at airports where there is an existing AF service, but that no similar process has yet been embarked upon, to my knowledge, at the other non-AF airports, if that makes sense.
Sure. Maybe it's Air Services, if you're still there, because I take that because I hear how busy now Brisbane Airport is, as if it wasn't busy enough as it was before. And certainly with COVID, with the three busiest routes was it Townsville, Cairns, Townsville, and Mackay. So Air Services, anyone got any? Can you enlighten the committee as to how things are sorted out there or what's happened, Mr. Hornsby?
Thanks, Senator. Michelle Bennett, Chief Service Delivery Officer. We don't have any staffing issues at Brisbane. We staff to CASA approved levels, always in accordance with the category of that aerodrome. So there are certainly no current staffing levels in Brisbane. In relation to the last part of your question there, in terms of Brisbane Airport, they're operating around 50% of pre-COVID levels currently, to the best of my knowledge.
All right, good stuff. And Chair, if you're still looking for where you're, I can ask one more, but
I have found my question, Senator Stewart.
No, look, I'll come back to you. Okay, we can always do follow-up in estimates, and it's only around that other new runway. That's fine.
Thanks, Senator Still. Coming back to ATSB again, are you aware of the Community Service Flight Instrument, which is due to expire in March 2022? And do you have an understanding of any specific examples where pilots have been prevented from flying?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Yes, I am aware of the instrument that was brought in. And as I'm no doubt aware, both yourself and Senator Stirl understand some of the background to that instrument. It is important to note that that didn't come from any recommendation from ATSB, nor was it from the data that we had collected as part of our investigation. There was one part out of the incident that led to it, or that was one of the precursors to CASA obviously considering it. There was 4 safety recommendations, of which 3 have been closed out. One of them was around collecting data around community service flights so that they were logged as such, which will help us and help CASA, no doubt, understanding the volume and the magnitude there. But in terms of the other parts of the instrument, and I know there are some other parts of that instrument that have affected that particular community service flight industry, they weren't based on our recommendations and really are a question for CASA. So I guess we don't have a view based on our data as to whether it was appropriate and how successful it has or hasn't been, and that's something that I think that CASA would need to answer.
All right, fair enough. Well, I'll leave the rest of those questions for CASA then. And finally, I received today results of a survey of pilots as commissioned by Country Airstrips Australia in relation to the current PPL Class 2 medical. The survey was conducted from the 8th of November to the 5th of December, so very current. 790 pilots completed the survey. I have tabled that survey, so it is available, or it will be available from the Secretariat's or the committee's webpage. Just a couple of highlights. 90% of pilots believe that the PPL medical requirements are excessive. 64% of pilots have considered giving up flying due to the demands of the CASA medical process. 55% of pilots believe that Australia should adopt the RAAU's medical requirements, and only 4.8% of pilots believe that the current system should be retained. Do you have any views? I know that I've given you this at short notice, but do you think there's any evidence that the medical requirements need to be reviewed and perhaps be more fit for purpose for the different levels of flying category?
Thanks, Senator, for the question. I guess without wanting to dodge the question, it is probably a question for CASA in that the evidence that they would have amassed to bring those particular standards in play. We certainly don't, and not to my knowledge, have had investigations that have led to a safety finding or a safety issue that would suggest medical standards need to be amended, brought in line with others or downgraded. As I said at the big opening statement, we are very acutely aware of the importance of general aviation and for it to be both sustainable and profitable to continue. Our role is to make sure it's as safe as it can be. But again, our safety isn't based on subjective assessments of it. It's based on the data that we gather at accident sites and how we analyse that. So I guess anything else that comes in as an instrument or a legislation in the regulator's remit is based on their assessment and their data, and I'm not in a position to be able to comment on it.
All right. Well, I guess we've heard evidence today about the looming crisis, the shortage of pilots and maintenance engineers and other supporting aviation industry workers. And general aviation has long been the feeding ground for charters and then small airlines and then bigger airlines to provide that workforce. So, I feel passionately that general aviation has been starved off by regulation over the last 20 or so years in this country, and I flag for you my interest and my encouragement for anything that would allow this feeding ground for the rest of the industry to be allowed to repopulate and flourish. One thing I would just bring you back to is just your comment about the data used by CASA for the instrument for the community flights, community service flight instrument. That data was provided by ATSB, I believe. So,
sorry, Senator. We collect quite often in an investigation. We issue what's called a Section 32, which is a coercive powers. That is very protected under the TSI 2003 Act. We do not provide that data to other sources, and including regulators. That data that brought the instrument in that CASA relied on was their own independently collected data on that, is my understanding, Senator.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, I'll raise that later this afternoon as well. Unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of time that we have with you today, just so short for the amount of topics we could cover. Thank you all so much for the time you spent preparing your submissions and preparing for today. Please go with the committee's thanks, and we'll see you at estimates soon, Air Services and ATSB. And thanks for coming on and representing the UFA. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Senator.
Much appreciated.
Thank you, Senator.